So Mike, tell me, who or what is a sponsor?
To put it short, the sponsor is typically the developer of the building or the original owner of a building. That's your traditional sponsor. And then the sponsor that we deal with, that we get a lot of questions, are sponsors of co-ops and older condo buildings. These are the sponsors. They're the people who typically bought the building somewhere between 30 and 40 years ago. Those are a little bit different because typically you only sell the units once a vacancy comes up in that building.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The buyer shows up basically with their lawyers and their bank, or if they're all cash, and there's no purchase application, right? There's no the elusive board application or the board interview, condo or co-op, right?
Yeah, so that's the real value, is that you don't have to go through either a co-op application process or condo application, but there's also no interview process. There's no referrals, references needed, anything like that.
On that note, you just reminded me about an anecdote of a building down the street from where I grew up in Astoria, Queens. There was a huge lawsuit between the shareholders of the co-op and the sponsor, and apparently there was some sort of like embezzlement or something like that. There was a big money judgment. So the maintenance used to be very low in this building, and ever since that lawsuit unfolded the past decade, the maintenance literally more than doubled in such a short period of time, and anybody who wants to exit is having a very difficult time to exit. All right. Here we are. Episode 1, the Keeping It Real Estate Pod. Today's subject matter is, what is a sponsor unit? I'm Harry Zikos. This is my business partner, Mike Falchiere. Between the two of us, we have decades of real estate brokerage experience in New York City. We're born and raised New York natives, and we wanted to cover some subject matter that we deal with often in our book of business. And, we represent quite a few sponsors of buildings in New York, and we always get this question from buyers. I'm in a showing, and all of a sudden somebody says, Harry, what exactly is a sponsor unit? Can you tell me? So that's kind of why we're putting this video together. This is my business partner, Mike. I'll let him go into it. So Mike, tell me, who or what is a sponsor?
Thanks, Harry. To put it short, the sponsor is typically the developer of the building or the original owner of a building. And there's typically two ways you'll see a sponsor, especially in New York City, where we have a much older housing stock. And the traditional, more common thing that you see now is the sponsor, aka the developer, is the person who builds the building, creates the offering plan for the condo, and does the initial offering of selling off the units in the building. That's your traditional sponsor. And then the sponsor that we deal with, that we get a lot of questions, are sponsors of co-ops and older condo buildings. These are the sponsors. They're the people who typically bought the building somewhere between 30 and 40 years ago. It used to be a rental building, and they got enough of the renters to want to buy into the building, and then went to the Attorney General and converted the building for a rental to a co-op or condo. Those are a little bit different because typically you only sell the units once a vacancy comes up in that building. So it's not as predictive as a process as these newer buildings when you get sales. Sometimes a sponsor of a co-op or a condo of a former rental building can have one vacancy 1 year, and then it could be another 10, 20 years until they have another vacancy. It's usually until a tenant, unfortunately, either dies or moves out, and that's when the vacancies happen.
Mm-hmm.
They usually renovate the unit and then sell it to somebody. The value of a sponsor unit typically, and this is in both cases for newer buildings and these older co-op and condos, is that it's a much less rigorous application process. And that's why people really like sponsor units, and that's why they're typically more valuable than a typical resale unit.
So let me try to distill this. Correct me if I'm wrong. We've done a handful of sponsor deals since we started working together for well over a year now, almost 2 years. And the buyer shows up basically with their lawyers and their bank, or if they're all cash, and there's no purchase application, right? There's no board the elusive board application or the board interview, condo or co-op, right?
Yeah, so that's the real value, is that you don't have to go through either a co-op application process or condo application, but there's also no interview process, there's no referrals, references needed, anything like that. It's usually just what the sponsor wants, and typically they just want to know that you can afford to pay and close on the unit. So that's the value. People who like privacy and don't want their neighbors knowing about their financial business or personal business will usually be more attracted to a sponsor unit. Sponsor units are also very attractive to foreign buyers, especially if they don't have US credit. So because of that, you get a lot of foreign buyers that want it. Parents who are buying or gifting for students, or children who are right out of college who don't have traditional work experience or financial history to approve or get approved by a co-op board. So that's the true value of these sponsor units, especially in the older buildings. They pop up very infrequently and randomly, but when they do, it's a great opportunity, especially for a first-time buyer or somebody who, whose financials are on the fence, to kind of have an opportunity to get home ownership in New York City.
It's funny you mentioned a couple of those details with foreign nationals or foreign buyers in general. I'm literally dealing with this on my desk right now. We have a guy who works with the UN. I'm not going to say names or anything, or I'm going to be very ambiguous. Well, we have a guy who works with the UN. I see Rady in the background, your puppy there. She's the co-star of the show here. So the guy works at the United Nations. He has some sort of a mission to the UN role within his work, and his wife's a professor at a large New York-based university. I won't say which university. And their U.S. credit is not the greatest standings in the eyes of a typical co-op board or even a condo. Potentially, maybe they would reject it on some basis, right? And his only avenue for housing security is to purchase a sponsor deal. And we just got an accepted offer on one, and we're working on the contract as we speak. So knock on wood that it goes through for his sake. And that it's this happening all over the place. Like, I'm seeing situations where people won't meet the DTI or debt to income ratios that a lot of these co-ops or condos might require, mostly the co-ops, obviously. And it's a great way for a buyer to circumvent a lot of these headaches and pain points that can take a month to 3 weeks to, let's say, even 8 weeks extra time throughout the purchasing process to even get into a deal. So I mean, it's definitely interesting. So now, I know you've definitely come across this with some of our clients that we share together. Are we doing a lot of deals that are only sales that are sponsor units? Because I mean, there's also sponsor units that you can rent out hypothetically, right?
Yeah, so sponsors, they don't traditionally rent, most of them, but a few of our clients, have decided that their portfolio is mostly a landlord buy, hold, rent portfolio. So they do rent out their sponsor units in some co-ops. The value of that, again, is that they do, as the sponsor, they do not need board approval to rent their units out. The sponsor retains these rights. They don't need board approval to do a renovation. It does need to be, a license and approved by the Department of Buildings and everything like that. But the board doesn't get to approve if they can renovate or not, things like that. They don't get to approve their buyers. They don't get to approve their sales price. So it's very advantageous for a sponsor. They're able to liquidate easier. They're able to rent out easier. There's no limitation on how long they can sublet. So if a co-op has some sort of sublet policy or restrictions, the sponsor is not privy to that. So we do get a lot of people who like to rent sponsor units, and the value of that is there's no limitation on how long they can stay for, no co-op fees, no co-op board approval. And typically, not always, but most of the time, you typically have a better living experience in a co-op or a condo, because most of the people living there are shareholders or equity holders, And because of that, they typically keep better care of the common areas and things like that.
Yeah.
It's less of a revolving door than some of these, 700, 800, 1,000 unit buildings you have that are strictly rentals. So you kind of get
Nobody
it.
banging the music at 3 a.m., 4 a.m. on a Tuesday.
You also, you just get more of a sense of community sometimes, things like that. People live there longer, raise their families sometimes in the buildings.
They become
So,
friendly with the doorman, whatever the case might be. They get friendly with the super. It's the same faces for a while. It's less corporate feeling, perhaps.
I mean, that's the value. I mean, one thing for everybody to know is you reap the benefits of the sponsor units, right? And the technical term is actually the holder of the unsold shares in a co-op,
Hmm.
right? So once the sponsor sells this unit or that's allocated to certain shares, those shares become, from unsold to sold, and now they're, out there on the market. Once that happens, the sponsor rights of those shares no longer exist. So it's only a one-time thing. Once you purchase that sponsor unit, you no longer retain any sponsor rights.
Right.
So it is a one-time thing. It's really only valuable to you on the purchase side of things. But it is nice because it does make your process faster, less rigorous, things like that. So that's what's really nice about these sponsor units. And the other thing too is, especially from the older housing stock, we're not getting more of them. We're only getting less and less as they get sold off. So the supply of unsold shares in these buildings slowly is diminishing, as we go on in time.
Yeah. So I
Um,
mean, they basically become resales if they ever have to go sell in the future. So if you even
exactly.
bought from a sponsor, to reiterate, right, you're gonna have to take, if you have to get your equity out of a co-op or a condo that you bought from a sponsor or a developer, you have to make the next buyer go through that same process, fill out a purchase application, board package, potentially even an interview with your co-op board if it is a co-op. Condos usually don't have the interviews, as we may all know. So that's important to delineate the two benefits. Mike, tell me, are there any negatives to a sponsor deal, or is there a potential detractor to a potential buyer on maybe a building with a lot of sponsor-owned units or something like that? Tell me a little what you think about this.
I mean, there are some negatives, right? Um, I would say, or some risks per se. And I'd
Hmm.
say, one potential risk with a sponsor unit, and it's not even dealing with like the acquisition itself, right, of that unit. It could be people in the building, but if there are a lot of sponsor units in a building and the sponsor doesn't do a good job vetting the buyers and stuff,
Hmm.
then you do run into issues, right? I've heard of, not going to speak specifics, right, but I've heard of buildings, through stories where a sponsor unit was sold and a broker didn't do the proper vetting or whatnot, and it ended up, turning out that that person was on a sex offenders list, right? So that kind of snuck through the cracks because there was no mandatory background check or screening, right?
Hmm.
Through
Hmm.
either a management company or co-op board. So those are some potential risks, right? There's just, less of a potential screening process for who's coming into the building and purchasing.
It's
Um,
a good
an,
point, honestly.
Another one that I'm actually dealing with a very good friend and client of mine now in Brooklyn. You know, we're on the buy side here, and she's actually buying from a sponsor that you and I represent in another borough in Queens
Yeah.
and Bronx and Manhattan. And
Yeah.
so we're not representing the sponsor on this sale, but it's, we know everybody involved, and, the
Gotta love it
attorney
when
was,
that happens.
the attorney's nervous, and this does happen, right? I've seen where, especially if there's a lot of majority of unsold shares, a lot of these banks are hesitant to, lend in the building. And
Yeah.
the reason being is, there's risk if the sponsor goes under or has an issue, and, they can't make their payments, and, depends on if they're levered on the property or not, right? Like,
Yeah.
on top of that, they, if 50% of the building can't pay their maintenance for a few months, it could cause issues, or the
Get
common
on
charges if
that
it's a
note.
condo.
On that note, you just reminded me about an anecdote of a building down the street from where I grew up in Astoria, Queens. Uh, anybody who knows this neighborhood, like they'll probably figure out which building I'm talking about, but I'm not going to mention it because I just don't want to poo-poo anybody particularly. This building had a sponsor who owned all the retail, right? It was mixed use. It was like a full square block, whole, city block in the neighborhood. And the sponsor apparently, made a lot of missteps on valuing his retail. He had a retail vacancy for a nice percentage of the retail was vacant for, we're talking close to a decade, just like somebody very disagreeable, very difficult to deal with. And apparently there was a huge lawsuit between the shareholders of the co-op, all the normal shareholders, and the sponsor. And apparently there was some sort of like embezzlement or something like that. There was a big money judgment. He squandered a lot of funds, and the co-op had to go into financial hardship. So the maintenance used to be very low in this building and used to have a very chill vibe on its house rules. And ever since that, lawsuit unfolded the past decade, the maintenance literally more than doubled in such a short period of time. And anybody who wants to exit is having a very difficult time to exit. And the building is littered with a bunch of now renovated apartments, but a bunch of product on the market with really attractive price points. But very few people can successfully sell, even with a cash deal. And now that because they had, the shareholders had to bring in, the board had to bring in a good management company, they went through like 5 management companies in the past 2 years. I mean, it's just like a changing of the guard. And that goes to tell you, like, there's pros and cons in all of your decisions when you're purchasing. So it's important to have people, could be us, shameless plug here, could be us, to guide you in which buildings to look out for, to avoid, and not fall into these pitfalls. This is a short and sweet episode. We really wanted to create a education catalog on something that we deal with intimately on a day-to-day basis. Both of our social media handles are below: Instagram, Twitter. I think Mike's on TikTok. I'm barely on TikTok. You won't see much there from me. And also, if you have questions on anything, if you're interested in buying, selling, we even have a team of people that help people rent apartments or rent out apartments for landlords. Send us a note. Find us on Instagram. Send us a DM. Mike, you have anything you wanted to add before we end this?
No, I'm good. I mean, give us a call if you are in the market, especially for sponsor units. They're very unique. It's interesting to navigate, but there's some good opportunities out there.
Exciting stuff. All right, guys. Until then, we're signing off. We'll see you on the next one. Keeping It Real Estate, episode 1 in the books, baby. Have a great night.